Give us some coffee. All right, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you all. Good to see you all again. Please remember that quiz 3 ends tomorrow, Friday. So if you haven't taken it, please take it. And don't forget that paper number 2 is due on Sunday, the 29th, I believe, yes? So if you haven't started on that, please start on that and upload it to Canvas, okay? And I think that's all. I always love to turn the page. Every beginning of every semester, I look at the class attendance and I'm like, wow, a lot of classes, how fast are they going to go by? And it always surprises me how quickly I have to turn the page. Time just flies. Maybe not for you, but for me. It seems like that. So I've turned the page. We've reached a milestone on my class attendance sheet. Alrighty. So today we're going to talk about the human person. What is a human being, a human person? Why does it matter to bioethics? Why does it matter to healthcare? And why should it matter? Well, the simple answer and the long and the short answer is how you view the human person is basically how you're going to treat the human person. It's really that simple. Your philosophical understanding, your theoretical understanding of what a human person is going to govern just instinctually how you treat that person, how not just treat that person as a human being, but treat that person as a patient, how you relate to them. So it's an important concept to go over. Okay, let me see Ms. Reyes is here. Okay. What does start out with? Whoops, wrong computer. We'll start out first with what does science say the human person is? We'll start with that. Well, a human person, it's a multifaceted definition. First of all, a human person is bipedal, which means that he or she walks on 2 feet. Pedis is Latin for foot. Humans are primates. What does that mean that we're primates? We are animals. We're characterized by binocular vision, which means we have 2 eyes set reasonably far apart from each other. Our eyes aren't on the side of our heads or on top of our heads or on projections from our body, as with some fish. No, we have binocular vision, which allows us for depth perception. That seems to be the purpose. Interesting that there's a purpose to our binocular vision. I don't know if that's intended purpose, like an intelligent designer, or if it's just evolutionary. It just so happened that we won the crapshoot and we got binocular vision, which allowed depth perception, and hooray for us. We are mammals. Oh, I put that third. We are mammals, which basically means, it can mean some other things, but basically it means that females nourish young with milk secreted from mammary glands in the breast. And apparently men have some sort of vestigial mammary glands as well. Men can apparently secrete milk as well, apparently. But mainly females, mammary glands, hence mammals. The fact that we're mammals also can indicate other things, like we have hair on our bodies and stuff like that, hair or fur on our bodies. It's another distinguishing characteristic of mammals. Okay, Ms. Mitchell. So maybe Mr. Saravo. Again, the wrong computer, Dr. Dunn. We have a large brain capacity in relation to the rest of our body. We have a large brain capacity. Enlarged brain. We are capable of expressive, communicative speech. Oh, wait, that's another thing. I forgot to put that down. We are able to reason abstractly. We are able to conceptualize, the definition of a concept, something where you're able to universalize something from a particular instance. We are able to conceptualize. Abstract can also mean symbolic, I guess. We're able to have symbolic thought. For example, a poem is a concrete thing. It's a poem. But poetry is an abstraction. It's a generalization from that concrete thing. A human being is a concrete thing, an individual human being, versus humanity or the human person, which is what we're doing. We're abstracting. And we are the only surviving member of our genus, which is Homo sapiens. The word homo in Latin simply means a human being. Homo homines is the plural, or homines is the plural, hominis is the genitive or the possessive. I should have also mentioned one thing in regards to primates. I forgot to mention that not only do we have binocular vision, but we also have specialized hands and feet for grasping. So one thing that unites primate animals is that we have hands for grasping. The way our hands are designed, we're able to hold on to things, in addition to an enlarged brain. Both the fossil record, fossils are imprints into stone of ancient animals. When they die, sometimes they become embedded in the sediment, and the sediment hardens, and it forms like a picture, almost kind of a reverse sculpture, if you will, of the animal in the stone. And you can date the fossil from usually the age of the stone. So we have a fossil record, and the fossil record, cannot necessarily be too accurate, but it has been backed up by genetic testing. So both the fossil record and genetic testing agree that this unique creature that we call the human being evolved out of Eastern Africa, specifically Ethiopia, if you're interested, around 195 to 200,000 years ago. 5,000 to 200,000 years ago is when you have this specific species of Homo arising. And here's just a map to show you, in case you don't know where Eastern Africa is, or Ethiopia. This is the country of Ethiopia. This is Eastern Africa, obviously, the continent of Africa. So when they've done genetic testing around the world, but also the fossil record confirms this. So the fossil record came first, and then they confirmed it when they were able to do genetic testing, that yes, all human beings seem to go back to this region of the planet at some point, developed out of the ancient human beings, and then spread. How many migrations there were, we don't know, but there seems to have been a migration along the coast. For example, the Arabian Peninsula and India, going all the way over to this region of the world, and eventually Australia. How were they able to do that? Well, because the ocean levels were lower then. And there were a lot of land bridges. So it was possible to walk across. You weren't walking across water, or it was easier to get across the waterways than it was now. So the climate's always changing. The Earth is always changing. It's not a static entity, the Earth. So things can be very, very different at different times of the history of our planet. At that time, the ocean was at a lower level. Why? Because we had the Ice Age. And so a lot of the water was locked up in the ice in the northern hemisphere. Eventually, humans found their way across this land bridge, the Sinai Peninsula. Don't want to get too close, Mr. Mitchell. This land bridge, and went up here, and there seems to have been a separation in human beings where one group went east and eventually was able to cross over into the New World. Let's call this the New World, even though, it was the New World for them, but they didn't know it was there. We crossed over to North and South America, and then another group went this way and ended up eventually the island of Ireland, and of course had to stop because you had this big gulf of an ocean there, so they couldn't go any farther. Okay, so bipedal, primates, mammals, large brain capacity, expressive communicative speech, abstract reasoning, only surviving member of its genus. These are all generally descriptive of humanity. It doesn't really tell us anything about the essential value or the worth of humanity. It doesn't really, it gives us a description of human beings, but it doesn't tell us what human beings really are or why human beings are important. Obviously, we're different. Okay? Yes, we are primates. And sometimes we act like primates. If you've ever been to like a UFC fight. But anyways, yes, we are primates. Our closest ancestor is the chimpanzee. But the last time I checked, I haven't had any chimpanzees registered for any of my courses. So I'm going to assume that there's something different about us, because we're all here, than a chimpanzee, despite how closely we are related genetically. There seems to be something different about a human person, and that we are persons, or you could say people as well, that other primates, even other animals, are not in the same way. We treat ourselves differently. We seem to have this intuitive sense that we're different. So yes, there is a lot of crossover in relationship with the animal world, but something makes us different, and that would be, I would say, personhood. Philosophically speaking, we have to get a little philosophical here. What is a person? And coming up with the correct definition of person, God bless you, Ms. Reyes, is not easy. Okay, I have to, had to think about it and stuff like that. And this definition is based on the traditional definition. But a person is, philosophically speaking, any being with a rational ability, the ability of reason, that exists completely in itself as an individual. That's what a person is. And again, I'm going to say it's not a perfect definition, because you could say, well, don't animals have some sort of exercise of reason? You said other primates have an enlarged brain capacity. Don't they have some reasoning capability? Yeah, there seems to be some reasoning capabilities within the animal kingdom, such as it is. But it's also, again, ours is on another level. Okay? You don't see a chimpanzee doing trigonometry. So our reasoning capacity, yes, there does seem to be some reasoning, even in other animals, dogs and elephants, porpoises like dolphins and stuff like that, seem to be highly intelligent. But when we say they're highly intelligent, we're grading them, or we're judging them by our standard. They're highly intelligent in regards to us. If we hear whales making sounds in the ocean and communicating, we're kind of analogizing from our speech patterns and say, okay, yeah, they're talking to each other, stuff like, well, okay, yeah, but maybe they're not talking to each other. We're kind of imposing our intelligence and our standards on them. They're like us. So again, it comes back to us. What makes us special amongst the animals? We are persons. In Latin, the word persona means a mask. We still have this word, it comes into English as persona. A person has a certain persona, which means maybe their outward appearance and how they present themselves. But a persona was a word for the masks that usually actors would wear when they were acting on stage. They would not put on makeup, they would actually have masks they would put in front of their faces as their characters. So a person is rational. It has the use of reason. A person exists as what it is, meaning that it has its own nature. It has its own being of what it is. It is a human, not a chimpanzee. It is a human, not a dog, a human, not a plant. Okay, these things have their own nature as what they are. That's what nature means in philosophy. What something is. Basically what something is. Its substance or its essence. So it exists as what it is, and it is an individual. It is individualized, individuated, one might say in philosophy. That basically that it exists as a whole. Individual means undivided. It's undivided. It exists as a whole. It's not two people. You know, you've got a whatchamacallit, an embryo in the womb, and it's singular. Okay, it's individual, but once it twins, which can happen very early on, now you've recognized you have two individuals. It's now you've got. Why don't you have one person who's two? You know, you don't. You have two because they both have their separate chromosomes. We recognize that they both have the two sets of chromosomes. So now we recognize that it has its own nature. It's human, but it's also now an individual, which can sometimes not happen. Because if you read in the textbook in the final chapter where Cain talks about Siamese twins and stuff like that, sometimes it cannot happen where you don't seem to have two individuals because they're attached. They're attached in their organs, attached in their bodies. But they might have the use of reason, which would make them individual. So man has the power to reason and understand, which is the intellect. And due to this reasonable capacity, this tells us something more about man's dignity or humanity's dignity, value, and worth. How so, Dr. Dunn? Well, I'll tell you, Ms. Reeser. Because man can think about and order his life. Remember what reason is. Reason is the ability that we have through the intellect to think and understand in an orderly way. That's a value, that's a benefit. And to understand and think in an orderly way implies that there are rules to be followed. There's an order that can be followed. It's not just an order that you're imposing on the world. Sometimes our mind does. Our mind can impose order on the world. Our own order on the world. I want to think that the world is this way, but you have to be careful with that because if you follow it too far, you can sink into madness. You know, you can sink into insanity, and that's kind of like what insanity is, where a person imposes his or her order of their mind onto the world, which doesn't work because the world doesn't work that way. So there's an order to be discovered and adhered to. This is then morality or ethics, an order about how to act, about how to do things. See, an insane person, a person who has mental illness, like a schizophrenic or someone where their mind has a different sense of what the order of the universe or the real world is, they try to impose that on their actions. And that's why they can't function. They're not functional. They might see something and react violently to it because that's the order of the universe that their mind is telling them is there. Like their mind might be saying there's danger here when there's no danger actually in reality, but they react violently to it or forcefully to it, which doesn't work. It doesn't make them functional because that's not what the reality is. So morality or ethics is an order by which to act. And we see this with our brains. So human beings are moral agents. Agent means someone who does something to something or someone else. Human beings make decisions about how to act. And to do this, to make a decision, the human being must have the ability to make choices, which in philosophy, you can call it whatever you want, but in philosophy it's called a will. And I've already talked about this before, so I don't need to, again, go over it too much because we have the definition. But the ability to make choices, to choose how to act, to truly make choices, one should be, by definition, free. Freedom. Otherwise, choice is fantasy. And there are philosophers and neuroscientists and scientists in general who would agree with the position that we really aren't free, that there is no free will. I think I've mentioned him before, the neuroscientist Sam Harris. talks about, in studying neuroscience, he said that human beings are a biochemical puppet, I think is the phrase that he used, that there really is no free will. He doesn't believe in free will. And he learned this from studying neuroscience, that the chemicals in our brain, the way our brain is wired, so has his study of those things has so convinced him that really just the decisions I think I'm making freely are already, in a sense, predetermined by the biochemical makeup and neurological makeup of the brain that I have. And there's no getting out of that. The Catholic Church does not think that. The Catholic Church believes that the human being is free. And I think you can know this rationally just from the sense that we do make choices. Even if the biochemical processes of the brain have influence, your genetics have influence, I don't see that you jump from influence to lack of freedom. Because at some point, out of all those influences, one of them has to be chosen. You have to do one of them. You can't do all of them. All the things that again, this leads to mental illness and insanity, where people who are like obsessive compulsive, they get locked in because they have so many things that their brain wants them to do. They can't choose any one of them and don't do any of them. They get what's called locked in syndrome. So freedom. The power or the ability to perform deliberate and responsible actions comes from the Old English word freo. And you can see what it means: to be exempt from, to not be in slavery to act according to one's will. But freo can also mean to be joyful and beloved. I don't know that we use it in that sense anymore, but anyways. And the fact that we are able to perform deliberate and responsible actions, actions that we can deliberate about, think about the action, and be responsible for the action, is exposed or shown to us in the notion of responsibility. Responsibility. Responsibility is the state of being called upon to answer or account for the consequences of one's own behavior. Okay? How can you be responsible if you have no free will? Or if your will is so locked in and tied to the processes of this physical thing called a brain, which is really limited. I mean, our brains are limited, obviously. They're limited by simply the space within our skulls. It's interesting to give that we, well, it's interesting. It's interesting. I don't know where I'm going to go with this, so I'll leave it alone. And I have a half-baked thought, and I'll have to let it bake a little bit more. A bun in the oven, right, Mr. Sarabo? Put it in there, let it bake a little more. Come back to it later. Responsible comes from the Latin word respondeo, which means to give or promise something in return, to answer, to reply, to respond, which is where we get our word respond. You have to answer for what you do. How can you answer for something if it's predetermined by your brain? If there's no free will, the implication there is that there is some sort of freedom, because you can't be blamed for it if you're not truly free. We accept some responsibility. We also recognize the role that the brain does play in some cases, because if a person is mentally ill and commits a crime, the courts will recognize a diminished capacity, that they weren't totally free due to the processes of their mental processes. But a person whose brain seems to be functioning perfectly fine, has a rational capacity, we assume that they're free to perform their actions, and therefore they are responsible, and if they do something that is against the law, they can be punished for it. On the flip side, you can also be rewarded. So punishment and reward. So if the will is not free, there's no true responsibility for our actions, because there's no true choice. In bioethics, They have similar terminology that's sometimes used in bioethics, and you might come across it in your medical practice, which basically boil down to reason, intellect, and the will. And reason and intellect are sometimes called decisional autonomy, which is basically your decision-making capacity as a human person. That you are competent, and I gave you a definition of competence before. Don't remember what it is off the top of my head. But anyways, I should know. But I talked about competence in regards to autonomy and informed consent. That you have basically the ability to make decisions for yourself and to order your own life. All right, decisional autonomy or a decisional capacity. And sometimes you'll hear this used when you're in your medical practice, that they'll say, they'll ask, is the patient decisional? Okay, which is another way of saying, is the person lucid enough to make decisions for himself or herself, or are we dealing with someone who's incapacitated in some way? The will is called executive autonomy. Can you execute your decisions? Do you have that ability? Okay. You can implement and carry out the decisions. Another way of putting this is you have self-governance. Self-governance. Okay. A person might have decisional autonomy, meaning they're conscious and able to talk to you and tell you what they want done, but they might not have executive autonomy because they're so injured, they're in such a state of suffering that they can't move or they can't do something, so they might not have executive autonomy. And some people might have neither. For example, a person in a persistent vegetative state obviously does not seem to have decisional autonomy because they can't communicate their decisions, and they don't have executive autonomy because they are comatose, essentially comatose, in an extended comatose state, and they can't do anything. They don't move, they don't do whatever. These two considerations of decisionality and also executiveness underline the concept of informed consent, but they also pertain to competence. Maybe I didn't give you a definition, so I gave it here. I think I mentioned competence in a previous lecture, but I didn't give a definition. And the state of being, having the required or adequate ability or quality. You have what you need to have to do something. You're competent. Competo, to agree or correspond with something. Yes, you have the corresponding ability. You have the ability to make a decision and carry it out. Incompetence does not necessarily affect personhood, since in the case of, say, incompetence, the ability is only impaired, it's not lacking. So that's maybe an assumption that people make in bioethics and when you're treating patients, that because a patient is incompetent, therefore competency is lacking. It's not there anymore. But really what's going on is it's only impaired. A person who's in a persistent vegetative state would normally be competent to make decisions and to execute them. What's interfering is that they might have brain damage or something going on with the brain. Or it might not even be brain damage. Sometimes doctors can induce a comatose state because a person is so sick, like there's swelling on the brain or something, that they want to reduce the swelling. And one of the best ways to treat the person and not go through that is to put them in a temporary comatose state with drugs. In that case, you wouldn't say, well, the person's not competent anymore, let them die, or they're not a human person anymore because they can't make decisions in this. Well, it's an impaired situation. A person who has a mental illness is impaired. They're not lacking in their competency. If they take their drugs, then they're not impaired anymore, and then they're competent. What has changed? Well, nothing's changed. It's just that you're dealing with, in one case, the person is sick. In the next case, they're not sick, or they're less sick. Let's put it that way. What does the faith say about the human person? Or can we talk about the human person? Was there anything the church has to say about that? Well, yes, it does. And for a discussion of human person, we can go to this document, Donum Vitae. The first two words in Latin, the gift of life. Donum is a gift, and vitae of life. by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It was put out in 1987, and it's an instruction. So it's it's setting out ideas in connection to the topic, and basically telling theologians and bioethicists, Catholic bioethicists, what are the positions of the church. It's instructing them on what the positions of the church are on various techniques and regarding what? Regarding respect for human life and its origin, and on the dignity of procreation. So the origins of human life, so it deals with things like in vitro fertilization, homologous and heterologous fertilization. It deals with the dignity of procreation. I think it deals with like frozen embryos, and do they deal with stem cell research, or they do that in Dignitas Personae, the next one? But anyways, they deal with things that are ethical issues that come up with the procreative faculty. And so in Donum Vitae, in this instruction, the congregation deals with the question of what is a human person, and kind of sidesteps it in a manner of speaking. It does not commit itself philosophically to a definition of the human person. Okay? I wish they had. I wish they had maybe given more thought to it, because I think you need that direction. You don't want to leave it. I don't think you want to, if you're going to deal with human life, I think you should have a solid foundation as to what a human person is first. But nevertheless, you take what you get. And so it doesn't commit itself philosophically, speculatively, to saying what a human person is, but it accepts that a human person exists when a human being or human life exists. When you have human life, you have a human person. The one and the two go together. So you could say that's kind of a definition of what a human person is. A human person is human life. And it's a flexible enough definition, because human life can be an embryo, which is at the monocellular stage, but has all the genetic code and the chromosomes of a human being in a human life. But it also extends to old age, where you have an elderly person who, again, is very old, but still is a human life. Or a person, it can extend also to a person who is, again, I mentioned this already, but a persistent vegetative state or comatose is a human person. A person who has mental illness is a human person. Why? Because it's a human life, and there's something special about that life. This is what they say in section 1, part 1. They say, the recent findings... page here. Anyway, does anyone want to read this? Anyone interested in reading this? From Donum Vitae. What is it? I got you, sir, but you've done it before.
Not me.
I'm not saying not you, but let's see. Does anyone else want to do it? Well, Mr. Kazan's done it before. I don't want to dump the whole load on Mr. Kazan. I'm his Reezer. Yes. Welcome to the show. It's Hellfest. No, I'm kidding. I watched the movie Hellfest last night, which is a lot of violence. Just be aware of that. So let's see. I don't want to call anybody. Okay, Mr. Kazan, I don't want to call anybody out. So.
All right. The recent findings of a human biological science recognize that in the zygote resulting from fertilization, the biological identity of a new human individual is already constituted. Certainly, no experimental datum can be in itself sufficient to bring us to the recognition of a spiritual soul. Nevertheless, the conclusions of science regarding the human embryo provide a valuable indication for discerning by the use of reason a personal presence at the moment of his first appearance of human life. How could a human individual not be a human person?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so they're talking about biology. So they do delve into biology. Biology and remember, faith and reason go together. So the human sciences are a datum, plural of data, are a source of knowledge for us. And but biology doesn't answer everything. But the recent findings of biological science recognize the zygote. And the zygote is a stage of development in the germ cells. Once the germ cells of the gametes of the ovum and the egg come together, they form an embryo in different stages. I'm forgetting the exact stages, I have to look it up, but I think it's embryo, zygote, blastocyst, something. And just the stages as it progresses and then implants itself into the uterus. But the zygote resulting from fertilization, the biological identity of a new human individual is already constituted. So we know this from biology. Biologists can tell from looking at a cell that it is a human cell. They can tell from its genetic makeup, from the chromosomal makeup. It's not a going back to chimpanzee. We are very, very genetically close to chimpanzees. I think it's by maybe 1 or 2 genes or something like that, but we're very close. But you can still tell the difference if you put, on a microscope, a cell of a chimpanzee zygote and a human zygote. You can tell the difference. So biology tells us that we can tell what kind of creature we're dealing with, even at that early stage of development. Now, the datum, whether you can sufficiently prove a spiritual soul from science, they say there's no experimental datum that is sufficient to bring us to that, because the soul is a spiritual entity. And someone might say, well, yeah, obviously, because the soul is airy-fairy and it's a made-up thing. But no, I mean, yes, maybe it is, and I'm just blowing smoke all these years, but the science deals with the physical material world. We know that there are things that are not physical and material. You could call them spiritual if you want to, that science cannot really get a full grasp on because it deals with the physical material world. And science is very, very good at telling us about the physical material world. It's not so good about telling us about the spiritual world, because that's not its area of expertise. So anyone who has to deal with the mind is spiritual. It's non-material. Although not all people believe this, they think it's very material. But try to get a grasp on the human intellect or the human mind. Those of you who are going to do social work or will have to take some counseling classes and deal with psychology. And psychology is more of an art than a science, you'll find. There are a lot of things that, we'll talk about the amygdala and what the amygdala can do with human memories and how it holds human memories and it can, it can hold traumas, and that's why you have PTSD, post-traumatic trauma syndrome, and stuff like that. But what is this thing? What are these things? What are these things that can you show me in the amygdala where is the memory of this trauma that I survived and that keeps recurring and coming back and troubling me with mental illness? Mental illness is hard to treat and hard to cure, precisely even with drugs, precisely because there is that non-material element we call the mind. The conclusions of science regarding the human embryo provide a valuable indication, notice not an answer, for discerning by the use of reason a personal presence at the moment of the first appearance of a human life. So this is where they equate personhood with human life, and then they ask the question, which I wish they wouldn't do because it's not really a good argument, I think. How could a human individual not be a human person? It's kind of like this rhetorical question. How could a human individual not be? And I don't think that, just from an argumentative perspective, that's not a good argument. It's like, it has to be, Okay, explain to me why it has to be. Don't let it stop. Don't stop there. This is your job. This is what they're paying you for at the Vatican. But again, you got to work with what you got, and that's where the Catholic Church is. Sometimes the magisterium doesn't have an answer for every question. It can give indications about how to act, but it doesn't have an answer for every question. Okay, and that's part of the humility we have to have as human beings, because we're human beings guided by God, but we can get it wrong. We might not understand where God is leading us, or we might not understand. So maybe there will be a fuller answer in the future, but as it is, the church has kind of just left it there. God can tell us something, or if you don't want to believe in God, then the Bible can tell us something. These book of human wisdom. And here we have a quotation from the book of Genesis, chapter 1, which is one of the creation stories. There are two creation myths in the first book of the Bible. I'm not going to go over the second, older creation myth because it would take too long, and I don't want to go too long into lectures. So I'll focus on the second one, which is a younger version and a later version, and is perhaps more theologically developed than the second one. This is the one that you probably have heard about God creating the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rests. So this is the famous story of that. And within that, on the sixth day, is the final day of God's creative process, is when he creates humanity. And the Bible says this: "Then God said, let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the tame animals," already tamed animals. I wonder how that happened before humans. Because, you have to have a human to tame an animal. That's what taming's all about. Just tells you something about the author. Author's making assumptions. "All the wild animals and all the creatures that crawl on the earth." So God cares about the bugs. So we have dominion over the bugs too. That's nice. Lord of the Flies. God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, meaning the human beings he created, "Be fertile and multiply." Ooh, God likes sex. Isn't that interesting? Don't hear that enough at church, maybe. Imagine your priest or minister talking about that. Anyways, "Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all the living things that crawl on the earth." And so it happened. What God says to come about comes about. His word is effective. It works to its purpose. God looked at everything he had made and found it very good. Very good. What does this little piece tell us about revelation? What the information that revelation can bring to the party? Well, God makes man and human beings in a manner distinct from the remainder of creation. And during the previous 5 days of creation, God makes the planets, the stars, the sun and the moon. He makes the animals on the earth. He makes the sea creatures. But in none of those cases does he make them in his image and likeness. It's only in the case of human beings, men and women, that God specifically says this creature will be in my, or our, interestingly enough, plural, image and likeness. Humanity is, and what does this mean? Does it mean the same thing? Do the words mean the same thing? Image and likeness are the same, or are they distinctions? Okay. We don't need to really get into that, but to suffice it to say that humanity is the image of God, quote unquote image, by being kind of like the physical representation of God in the world. We are God's ambassadors to his creation. We are the presence of God. Not that God isn't present everywhere, but human beings are the presence of God in a special way amongst the animals, amongst the created world, his image. And humanity is like God in his likeness by acting like God and being like God in his or her actions. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. God's image and likeness is where we find being created in God's image and likeness, I should say, is where we find the foundation of human dignity and worth. Because where else do you find it? And this, of course, is a Christian answer. If if other religions would have other answers, but this is the Christian answer and it's a Christian school, so that's what I'll go with. But philosophically, think about for yourself, where else would you find human value and human dignity and human worth? Give me a better answer, because I listen to atheists talk about these things and, go on YouTube and listen to debates and stuff like that. And human value and human dignity is kind of taken as an assumption. But I think it's an assumption that comes from our Christian culture. No matter how much we like it or not, America was founded by the majority of them people were Christians, some Jews, but mostly Christians, and the Western world has been Christian for such a long time that I think these ideas kind of percolate down like in the coffee, drip, drip, drip in a coffee pot, and they infuse us whether we would want them to or not. And so, sure, human beings have dignity and value. But we don't know why we believe that. We've lost the image and likeness of God part of it. But I think that's, at least for the Catholic Church, that's where the foundation is. To be in the image and likeness of God means that humans are finite, not gods, infinite, but finite. Finite means we have an end, we have a beginning and an end. Technically we don't have an end because our souls will live forever, eventually with our bodies. But we do have a beginning in life. We have a point where we start existing. We are finite reflections of the divine nature of what God is. But how is this? Just to give you one theory from a great Christian thinker, and not just a great Christian thinker, but a great thinker of human wisdom, this man, St. Augustine of Hippo, who was a bishop in northern Africa. I think the modern-day country of Algeria is where he was located. Excuse me. He died in 430 A.D. Anno Domini. He located the image of God in the mind. That's where he located the image of God, in the intellect, in the power of memory, the power of understanding and intellect, and in the will. So that's where he located that. That was the image of God. It's not in the physical body per se, but in the mental powers that we have of memory, intellect, and will. And according to this man, St. Augustine, men and women are images of God through their self-reflective consciousness. Their self-reflective consciousness. We're thinkers. We think about our thoughts. We can reflect on, we can not only think, but we can think about what we think and why we think it. We have the power to look within our own consciousness and to reflect and think about it and to have insights. That's how we gain insight. Insight, sight within. We look within ourselves and we come to revelations, in a way you could call it that, kind of natural revelations. Oh yeah, that's why something is the way it is, or this is why I act that way. This is the way the world is and people do this. And you have insights over your life. And that comes from this being in the image and likeness of God. At least for St. Augustine. Here we come to the idea of the soul. And you could use any other word for it. You could call it, the spiritual principle of life, or just the principle of life. That's probably in its most simple aspect, the principle of being alive. You don't have to, the soul is just religious terminology. But what is it? It's the spiritual, immaterial principle of the human being that acts as the living form of his or her physical body. I mean, something like this seems so obvious that it doesn't even need to be proven, but it kind of does, because there are people who say, well, no, there is no spiritual principle, immaterial principle. Why? Because you can't see it. But obviously there's something in our body, a surgeon can cut open the body, divide it into parts, take out all the organs, and say, well, no, I don't find a soul in here. I don't find this spiritual, immaterial principle. Okay, fine. But explain what was operating that body before. Why was it a living body at one point, but then it's a corpse at another? Why is it a living, functioning organism at one point, but then it's just a disparate, connected set of organs that don't have any purpose anymore? Once the body becomes a corpse, the organs, something about them loses their own purpose. They lose their own meaning. And they degenerate. They have no meaning anymore. So the stomach's not doing what it's supposed to be doing anymore. The liver isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. The brain isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. So it starts to decompose. What was there at one point that's not there anymore? Even if you say, well, the brain stops functioning. When we talk about death and dying, we talk about that, total brain death. Okay. That doesn't, for me, it doesn't resolve the question. What was in the brain that even made the brain do what it does? I mean, what's the gasoline that you put into the machine? What's the gasoline? What's the special sauce that was there that's not there anymore? Call it a soul, call it whatever you want. But there seems to be some, and we say spiritual only in the sense of immaterial. There seems to be something that is not physical about human beings that acts as the living form for a body. It gives form. Once that form is gone, the body falls apart. And literally falls apart. And anyone who's seen a dead body, and some of you will, especially when you get into nursing school and you have to dissect. Do you have to dissect cadavers in nursing school? Like the doctors do? You have to dissect cadavers, dead bodies? No? Have you ever dissected a cadaver? Or, you have, Ms. Vokes?
Yeah.
Oh, really? A human cadaver? Yeah. Ooh! Halloween's just around the corner. When did you do this? Do you mind me asking?
I was an assistant at a physical therapy office or like a university.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was this part of your training program, or this?
It was just like volunteer work.
Volunteer. Oh, volunteering. This is kind of an interesting form of volunteering to help with the. What was the?
We were just watching the PT doctorate students do it.
Oh,
so,
okay.
We were like saying things for them and just doing whatever we needed to do for them.
So physical therapy students have to go through a dissection. So what was that like for you? Do you mind me asking?
It was especially seeing the faces. It's really it hits you that was a person, and then they're not there anymore. They're there, but it's that they had their own life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird.
It's weird.
It's really weird.
It's unusual.
Yeah.
Okay, so interesting. Yeah, so you see that the body is literally starting to fall apart. It's starting to decompose. That's what I mean that's what I'm trying to get at in the definition when I say that it is the living form. That it's the form, even the form of the body. When this thing you call a soul, call it spirit, or call it whatever you want, leaves, the body falls apart. Okay. And we see this. You can see that it's right there in front of you. It's empirically obvious. Okay, interesting. So the soul, get back to that. I've got more to say before I get there. The soul is that thing which brings all the disparate parts into a workable whole. Because our body is a bunch of disparate parts. Something brings them together into working as a whole. Let's call that the soul if you want. But it does more than that. Because you have a soul, it not just brings the disparate parts into a whole, but it gives them meaning and purpose. Okay, meaning and purpose. That there's not just a functional meaning and purpose, like the liver cleanses the blood. That's its function, obviously. But it gives the whole person, the human person, a meaning and purpose to his or her life. And such is the form, you could say it's the form of the body. It's giving the purpose to the body. But the soul is more than just being the thing that brings about life in a lifeless body. The soul has faculties, which is a fancy philosophical term for abilities. To have a faculty is just another term for an ability or a capacity. A facultas. And this is where I was talking about the mind before, and where does the mind get these things? Or where, it doesn't seem to come just from the brain, although the brain is certainly a part of it because we are physical as well as spiritual beings. And so, the brain, when I talked about reason and intellect before, there seems to be an interplay between them because when the brain is damaged, the intellect is damaged. It doesn't work properly. So, the faculties that there are two faculties that I've already mentioned. So again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but the two faculties are thought and choice, or we could call them in more philosophical language, intellect and will. And you could also subsume or place under thinking the faculty of memory, which is kind of like thinking about past actions, past events. It's still thought, but it's a different kind of thought. So thinking and choosing come under the powers of the soul. That's where they come from. You could also say the mind if you want. So the human person is a unique composite. We're both material and spiritual. Both go together. We're both material and immaterial in some way. And those two components coexist, but not as two different things. Okay? This is something that the church has had to fight against, and because some Christians believe this and look at it this way, but the church does not. But they see what's called dualism, from the Latin word dua or duo, which means two, or duus, I should say, two. A dualism. They see a two-ness to the human person where they kind of separate out the body from the soul. And the soul is like one separate entity, and the body is another separate entity, and you have rules for both. So a famous group that does this that you may have heard of will be the Church of Christ Scientists, or the Christian Scientists, founded by a woman named Mary Baker Eddy. And her claim to fame, or her insight, was that, sickness was really the result of a sick soul. Your soul was in some sort of disarray, and if you got your soul set up properly and you healed your soul, then that would bring healing to the body. And so there's all sorts of training for practitioners of Christian Science to impart this wisdom, not impart this wisdom, but to put this wisdom into practice. This is a form of Christian dualism, that we're both bodies and souls, and we're like two separate things. And what can happen if you can do things to your body that don't affect your soul. So pain and suffering shouldn't affect your soul, but also things that in your soul might be happening, like sin or evil, can affect your body. So because sometimes we see this and people think like, well, I've committed a sin, therefore God gave me cancer. I got cancer because I committed a moral fault, which I'm not going to tell the Lord what he can and can't do, but it seems to me to be a form of dualism, of seeing like the soul is this separate entity, and what it does is going to now affect the body, which that is true, because we're talking about a unity, but not a duality, not a two-ness. There is an interdependent, the church sees it as an interdependent existence of two components. There's a distinction between the body and the soul, and that distinction is most obvious in death. That's what death is. It's the separation of the soul from the body. But they are two components of an interdependent existence, which together constitute one living human body, the one existing human person. From Donum Vitae, this is from the introduction. It is only in keeping with his true nature that the human person can achieve self-realization as a unified totality. And this nature is at the same time corporal, I think they mean corporeal, mean bodily, and spiritual. By virtue of its substantial union with the spiritual soul, the human body cannot be considered as a mere complex of tissues, organs, and functions, nor can it be evaluated in the same way as the body of animals. Rather, it is a constitutive part of the person who manifests and expresses himself through it. Well, what does that mean? Well, substantial union means natural union. For nature means what something is. So this union, by the nature of a human person, is to be a spiritual and material unity. Okay, so there's a unity with this union in human nature between the soul and the body, makes the body more than just a conglomerate of organs and tissues and whatnot. Okay, but it makes the body who someone is and how you express yourself through the body. This has implications bioethically for when we come to questions of like gender dysphoria, where a person thinks, in this sense, this is kind of a psychological dualism, not a religious dualism, where someone thinks that my soul, but they wouldn't call it that, my gender does not align with what my physical body says I am. My physical body indicates I'm male, but my gender or my mental state is telling me that I'm female. Now, these two things. I'm not making any judgment on that or saying that that's right or wrong or good or bad. I'm just saying it seems to be kind of a psychological form of this idea of dualism. Okay? Whereas from the Catholic perspective, as it will affect bioethics, no, your body reflects who you are and who you express yourself as. How you express your soul. It's part of who you are. This is from I don't think I have you read this. I have you read something else. But anyways, from Bishop Michael F. Burbidge, who is the Bishop of the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia. He put out a catechesis on the human person and gender ideology. So it's a teaching document by a bishop. So you could say it's part of the magisterium. It's at a low level because it's from a local bishop. And he talks about this. He made at least this comment that I thought was relevant. The human person is an embodied soul, the composite of the spiritual and the physical. The human soul is created to animate one particular body. To be a human person means to be a unity of body and soul from the moment of conception. Now, how do we know this? Well, we don't know this because you can't see God insert the soul and create the soul at the moment of conception. But the theological assumption is that, at least the teaching is that from the moment that you have a human life and a human person, then part and parcel of that is a human soul. Thus, the body reveals not only the soul, but the person. The person as a unity of body and soul acts through the body. Thus, each person's body given by God from the moment of conception is neither foreign to the person, it's not foreign to the person, it's not unusual, it's not a stranger, but neither is it a burden, but it's an integral part. The human spiritual soul is created directly by God for each individual human being. Because where does it come from? This is another interesting question that because you can look at the development, and really we do know very little about the development, the early development of the humans in the womb, I should say. We actually don't know much how an embryo develops. So maybe there'll be additional data, additional information that will come in a later date. But at this point, the question is, this question of a soul, but you could say the mind or the life part of it. Life starts with cell division according to biology. So that's an indicator. Once a cell divides, you have a life, even if it's not a human life, but you have cell division indicates life. Yes. But when do you have a thinking, reasoning, willing, choosing thing? Call it a soul. For religiously, we believe that it's created directly by God for each individual human being. But when does that form of the body take place? When does that immaterial element that seems to be there, even if you don't want to admit that it's in a religious perspective, you don't say, well, it's just there. Okay, fine. You don't need a God to acknowledge that, well, something is there. There's this immaterial spiritual element to us. Don't know where it comes from. It doesn't have to be from a God, whatever. But where does it come from? When does it arise? Does it arise when the brainstem forms in the embryo? I don't know. The religious teaching is that when the human life is present, God directly infuses the soul for when the material component is ready for it. So whenever the material component of the embryo is ready and it is truly a human life, it's obviously a human life, the belief is that God infuses an individual, unique soul. And it's a mysterious act which is beyond full comprehension. It's beyond full comprehension, namely, or what this means by saying it's a mysterious act, is that you're bringing something into existence from absolute nothingness. Absolute nothingness. Something wasn't there before. You had two different creatures. You had an ovum and you had a sperm cell. Okay? And which are very two different things. But once the sperm cell penetrates the ovum, which the ovum has to allow, by the way, it doesn't just happen. The ovum somehow chooses which sperm cell it wants to be able to penetrate, which already blows my mind. I'm like, how does the ovum know? But anyways, once that happens, you have something completely different emerging. And once you have cell division and multiple cell division, you have a life. Now, whether you want to say it's a human life or a human person, that's people debate that point. Okay, but you still have something that's living, that's organizing itself at that stage. Whether you believe it's a human life or just a glob of cells that are there, but eventually you can recognize it as a human life. If a body emerges, you have a heart emerging and beating, you have a brain stem forming. Okay, so the structures of a body are there. From what? From these two very different things. How does that happen? You have nothing really, and then you have a full-fledged you. Well, not a full-fledged, but eventually a full-fledged you. You have a bringing into existence of being something from really absolute nothingness, which is in itself is a mind blower, whether you're a religious person or not. It is the spiritual soul which, as the principle of life, the principle of unity, the principle of specificity, the form of the bodily being, is the thing that makes a human person a person. That's what I would say. To answer the question that the Vatican didn't want to answer, I would surmise that it is this soul element, call it the mind if that makes you feel more comfortable, or it's immaterial principle, whatever, but it is the soul element that's there, which makes a human person a person, and different from a German Shepherd, which we wouldn't call a person. Not that there's no life principle in other animals, that there's not some form or principle of life there, but it's different. We recognize that there's a difference there. And it's because of the gift of the soul, and a consequence of that gift of the soul, that each person has inherent dignity and sacredness independent of society's recognition. And it's that dignity that transcends age, condition, sex, socioeconomic status, whether you're rich or poor, your religion, your health, or the stage of development, whether you're at the initial stages of a human life or at the end stages of a human life. This is the reason why the human person is treated differently from any other animal. And that doesn't mean that we don't extend our dignity to other creatures as well. Because remember, part of bioethics, which I don't talk too much about, is bioethics has been extended to include animals and even the whole world. And what I would see is it's probably not a good idea. Kind of, in my mind, muddies the waters, because personhood, there's a sacredness that comes to us from personhood, from having an immaterial principle given to us by a God that makes us different from the other animals and the other parts of the planet. I think that what's going on there is we're extending that idea of ourselves as valuable to animals, and we see them as sacred because we are sacred. We see the earth as sacred because we are sacred. Again, we're kind of extending our own importance there, rather than these things necessarily being inherently sacred. Although you could say because they are created, they come from the same source of existence, they are creations of a good God, that they are, because they are good and very good, that you could say in a sense they are sacred. In that sense, they are set apart and meant to be respected by human beings in their ethical treatment. So when it comes to, say, medical experimentation, for example, the church would say, yes, you can experiment on animals, but you have to experiment on them ethically. You can't cause them undue pain and suffering in experiments. There are standards. The experimentation on an animal has to be for the good and benefit of human people, of human persons. You can't just do that because you want to do it, or create a better form of lipstick or perfume. which companies do. They have to experiment on something to make sure the lipstick doesn't cause rashes or, hurt people. So they use animals. They test on animals. The question is that ethical? This inherent dignity is also a gift of God. It's given freely by God. And so we have this final quote that I'll give you. This is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 33. The human person, with his openness to truth and beauty, his sense of moral goodness, his freedom in the voice of conscience, his longings for the infinite and for happiness, man questions himself about God's existence. All of these things that human beings seem to be so concerned about, recognizing beauty. Driving here today, I see all the flowers, not the flowers, but the leaves changing on the trees because it's fall, and it looks beautiful to me. I remember there's a guy, one of the atheist provocateurs, Richard Dawkins. He's a biologist and has written a bunch of books defending evolution, I should say, and stuff like that. And in one of his books, he goes, his little daughter said to him one day that, God made flowers. Or no, she didn't say God. Said, I think flowers exist to make the world beautiful. She's a little, like 7 years old or something. I think flowers exist to make the world beautiful. And Dawkins writes, it touched my heart, but I had to tell her she was wrong. Because he's a scientist, he's an evolutionist. And he had to tell him, no, a flower, the leaves just change in the trees because there's the chlorophyll is changing in the leaf, and there are flowers in the plant. There are flowers on the ground because they're there. They've evolved that way, and to their environment and to attract, and that's why they attract the flies and the bees and stuff like that to pollinate. It has nothing to do with a god and nothing to do with beauty or whatever, making the world beautiful. And okay, what a party pooper. But
what was her response like?
He didn't say what her response was. Yeah, but I can imagine she just accepted it as his daughter. But I thought that these questions of looking out and seeing the leaves change. Yeah, I can't deny the fact that it looks beautiful to me. But why do I see beauty in the world? Questions of beauty and truth, of moral goodness, that people do the right thing. Why do we care about those things? Our conscience, the fact that we want to maybe live forever for the infinite, that we assume that we'll go on forever, which is, we obviously know in the back of our minds is not going to be the case. No one in this room is going to outlive this century. Just not. And I will not outlive it. I was born in 1972. Maybe if I live to 100 years, that's 2072. I'm certainly not going to live to, it's just not going to happen. And the day that I realized that was, well, it wasn't a great thought. It wasn't something, but you come to a point in your life where you start realizing that, you have less part of the road to travel in your life. You're still at the beginning of it, thank God. And hopefully I will go before all of you. But we know we want to be infinite. We would like to think that things, we're going to be there for the next Taylor Swift tour, and that's probably might not be the case for somebody. And happiness, we want to be happiness. These are questions about the existence of God, the church would say. We're ultimately asking about God. Oh, yes, sorry about that. Good, I'll see you. I'll finish up on Monday, which is Halloween. And I'll see you all then. Have a good weekend.
Dr. Bell, on campus it says the papers due on Monday night.
Huh?
On campus it says the papers due on Monday night.
Okay, Monday night. Okay, that's my mistake then. The paper's due on Monday night. Okay.
It's due Monday night?
Thank you. Yeah, it's due Monday night. Sorry about that. I thought the 29th, but it's the 30th. My mistake. Thank you, Mr. Thatch.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a good weekend.
You too, sir.
Have a good weekend.
You too, sir. Thank you. Yeah, have a good weekend, sir.